So Josh is PM, and so Kirtana is DPM?
Yeah, I'm DPM. I have no gender preference.
Okay. And then for opening opposition?
Brian will speak LO, he, him.
And Devesh is speaking second, he or they pronouns is fine.
Okay. And for closing government?
Speaking first, Simran Sharma, she, her.
Speaking second, Sarah, she, her.
Cool. And closing opposition?
AR speaking first, no gender pronoun preference.
Hard speaking second, here, they.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to time, but you are also, of course, welcome to time yourself. I won't like aggressively pound or anything if you go over time, but I will stop listening, following, etc. So with that, I invite the Prime Minister to deliver a speech not exceeding 7 minutes, 15 seconds grace. You're here.
Awesome. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry, I wasn't able to catch that. I cut out for a second.
Yeah, I can
Okay,
I can hear you. Yeah.
We've just been having some tech issues. So if anything happens to me, I'll switch over to my partner's computer. All right. Okay. When you get home and it's been an extraordinarily long day at work, you plop on the couch and you're scrolling through your news feed, and what fills the feed are graphic videos, hyper realistic accounts of what the problems are in the status quo, things that you often feel like you don't really have participation in, things that you don't often feel like you are necessarily responsible for, but in general, it's overwhelming, it's all too much, and you either turn off, don't read it at all, or if you do read it, you still turn dark and grim in your own understanding of whether or not it's possible for us to change these things. That's what this debate is about. I think what our side looks like in terms of what aspirational visions of the future are, I think that we are challenging the viewer to imagine a future together where there is a possibility of success. I think it's narratives that include messaging incorporated around, we can get there, and here's how. I think it's aspirational messaging looking like, imagine a world where we have marriage equality versus a much more grounded like detailing of what the emotional harms are for someone who's locked out of the hospital room because they don't have legal recognition, or not able to be there for their partner on their deathbed. I think this is imagining a world where we don't have to suffer from air pollution anymore, and here's how we can get there, versus giving detailed accounts of what the percentage are of people in Bombay who are suffering from lung cancer, what the detailed accounts are, and the data is around what it is for people in Shanghai who also experience this. I think that largely what OP is defending is either things that are grounded in data, either things that are hyper realistic and borderline on grim because they're really reckoning with how problematic and structural and intrinsic and pernicious many of these problems often are, or both. And I think that on all fronts, we prefer it to be positive, aspirational messaging. And I think the metrics for this debate are twofold. One, where the message is better platformed, because note panel, a key prerequisite for seeing any of the benefits that we want as activist movements is for people to actually be listening to us first and foremost, but then also learning and actually internalizing and believing and buying in to what we're saying, which also triggers, I think, the second metric for this debate, where we just get better buy-in on activism, where people are more likely and more willing to participate and support activism. First case, why it is that people are just never going to, yes, clarification, CL?
In what way do you address an ideal future without addressing the problems today?
Exactly like I told you, instead of grounded in detail and going through how emotionally traumatic it is to not be able to be there for your partner because you don't have legal recognition. You instead show them something that looks a lot happier. Like, this is what the world could look like if we had a marriage equality. And here's how we're going to get there. What are the steps we're going to take without necessarily grounding in the emotional traumatic harms and making that visceral for the viewer in a way that turns them off. First case, why it turns them off. 2 levels, 1 on a personal level, 2 on a news incentive level. I think that the majority of the time when you're engaging with media, what you choose to click on is wildly influenced by what your daily capacity is. And I think a lot of the time you don't want to engage with these types of things. I think if op is looking at things that are grounded in data, what the percentages are, what the facts actually tell us. I think that we've been working all day. You have limited emotional bandwidth. You have limited like intellectual capacity for what you feel like you could possibly engage with on these things, especially when these things are far away from you. They don't feel like they permanently affect you. I think you're just likely to turn off and not read it at all and instead switch over to Netflix. I think that whether op is defending things that are hyper realistic, I think you're more likely to click on a BuzzFeed video that shows you like successful imagery about how it is that refugees can make their way out of camps and what that future possibly looks like, than a detailed BBC documentary that shows you the horrors of refugee camps in a way that makes you feel awful. Even if you start watching it, it's not what you wanted to watch after work. It's not what you wanted to watch with your friends, and you turn it off. And so I think a lot of times you actively opt out in choosing to engage with these types of activism, this types of messaging, because I think that a lot of the time you just don't want to engage it because it makes you feel bad and you don't feel like you have the capacity to do it. And I think also note it's an important framing that you often don't learn about these types of things otherwise. For example, you don't learn in school about the ways in which the government like blocks out and structurally disempowers bodies of color, because that makes the government look bad, and the government's not incentivized to include that in the school curriculum. So if you don't hear it from the activist messaging, you never learn it otherwise. You never know the problem in the power structures, and you never even have the initial capacity to be able to work to change it. But I also think, secondly, news organizations often don't platform types of things that op wants to defend. I'm going to bite the bullet. I think that there are hyper controversial things that pop up that happen in either world, right? Like, I think videos like George Floyd are controversial and they're graphic and they're probably going to happen on both sides of the house. But I think it's what happens outside of those types of pop-up videos, whether we get consistent platforming of our messaging or not. And I think that news organizations are not incentivized to do it in op world, because what you're defending in terms of hyper-realism, data, or both often looks like or feels like it's critiquing the state in a way that turns a lot of viewers off. You have like middle-of-the-road voters like my dad, who has spent his entire life working for the government. When he reads things that he views as hypercritical of the government, it makes him feel bad about his own identity and his own nationalism. He doesn't want to turn off from that, versus aspirational messaging that draws him in and makes him feel included in that future and doesn't trigger him from turning off because it activates things that he's not thrilled to talk about. And I think that all these things intertwine together, that means that op largely gets no solvency or actual witnessing of the types of messaging that they want to defend. And so I think in our world in general, viewers have at least some knowledge of these issues. When I frame for you, they often have no knowledge at all, which is the first step in getting them to engage with any type of activism. But I think secondly, if op wants to say that this triggers shallow engagement because you don't have the full scope of the problem, I'll tell you two things. One, shallow engagement is often great, because even if you don't know the full extent of the problem, when there's a link to a donation box at the end of the BuzzFeed video, you click on it, you donate money, and if you don't know the full amount of the problem, you're still contributing to the solution. But I think secondly, it also inspires you to look up more. Coming out of my conservative Christian military background, when I went to New York City and I saw these types of videos, even when I didn't have the full understanding of the problem, it was problems that I had never learned when I was growing up. It was totally outside my frame of reference that made me curious. I wanted to go look up more after that. But that curiosity is only triggered by me watching the video through to begin with, whereas otherwise I would turn it off in op world. So I also think we not only Trojan horse real activism, but also we Trojan horse initial knowledge that sparks curiosity in a way that we get full buy-in and a desire to want to advocate for social change. But I think the second thing is that even if a lot of the time op is able to prove that you are able to read these things, that you are likely to read these things, I think you're just likely to turn off. Because when you read just how awful it is that we're likely to see with global warming, the horrible things that are going to happen, when you learn about the ways in which the Kyoto protocols have no teeth, you learn about the ways in which the Paris Accords are not fucking working, I think it likely makes you feel like that the odds are so overwhelmingly against your favor that we are never going to win. And you instead respond by saying, you know what, fuck it, I don't think we're ever going to get there. And I think this results in a couple key harms, because when you take on this mentality that we're screwed, you take on this nihilism, you result in a couple of key impacts. First, you yourself are less likely to want to join the movement, because when you look at the personal calculus that it takes, the trade-offs of engaging with activism, it takes your time, it takes your money, it can often affect your social reputation if other people in your life don't agree with it. You have to be willing to trade those things off, because you have to think that it's worth it. You have to think that there is a future that we actually have a chance of fighting for. I think secondly, when you think that, like, when you're nihilistic, you don't feel like supporting movements who are fighting for these things, because you think that they are making trade-offs that are not worth it in the long run. So you don't vote for them, you don't support politicians who support them, you don't donate money to them, you don't think that they're working for something that actually has a chance of success. And I think all of this matters because a key framing is that even if we're not able to ultimately solve all the problems, some solve problems we won't solve, we want to mitigate the harms as much as possible, because the more money that we have, the more people we have fighting on this fight, the more we're able to mitigate the harms. And so even if the world ends up dying from global warming, if we're able to have less people who needlessly died when they were younger because of the results of it, because we had better activism than our world, that's why you vote for OG. Even if like we're not able to solve for pollution, if we have comparatively less people who have lung cancer in our world, that's why you vote for OG, because we have better activism, people better know about the problems, people are less nihilistic and are willing to actually fight to change them and participate in the change. Proud to propose.
I think the Prime Minister invite leader of the opposition. Also, I should have mentioned this earlier, but if people want to, at the beginning, like before their speech, indicate their preferred medium for POIs, that's fine. Like whether you prefer in chat or like a raise hand function on Zoom, or that people like directly butt in verbally. Yeah, you can just indicate that if you want.
I prefer to get POIs in the chat. Yeah, let's see. Cool. Am I audible to everyone?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. Firstly, I want to explain why we're more likely going to attain critical mass on our side. Secondly, I want to explain why it's more likely that we achieve policy. And thirdly, I want to explain why this affects the opposition when it comes to your movement in a terribly negative way as a comparative on their side. But before that, I just want to address a few things that we get from Prime Minister, right? The first thing that I want to just challenge is the overarching characterization that we got from Prime Minister, right? They tell us that people in the status quo turn off media when they see the horrors of reality. They think that, you know, there's an oversaturation of depressing media and sadness and the pains and the horrors of people, of other people's lives, right? I would just like to say that this is probably not an accurate characterization of how the average person receives media, right? I think it might be true that, you know, above average amounts of debaters may consume a lot of media about the pains of other people, but I think the average person chooses to live in a media sphere that makes them feel comfortable, just like the things that Prime Minister has told us. And because of that, more often than not, the average individual, the voters or the moderates that you need to be able to sway votes in order to change the direction of movements and activism are likely people who currently live in echo chambers of ignorance. That is to say, when they see a video that shows them pain, it's probably the first time they see it. They don't click away because they're depressed and that they've seen so much sadness and there's no way to fix it. They might click away because they don't believe it's true. They might think that, you know, a lot of the issues that are brought up by the liberal left side are actually fake news. But I would say overall, overarchingly, the people that we need to change in this debate are likely people who haven't seen enough of what reality looks like, not people who have seen way too much, right? Secondly, they tell us, you know, you're more likely going to click the happy video about individuals because you don't like seeing the pain, right? I think there's two things here, right? I think the first thing to point out is just like you tend to click on things that are, you know, more sensational than the average media that you consume. And I think it's probably going to be in this debate pretty symmetric about which side can spin things to be more sensational, whether it be bad things or good things. So I think when it comes to clicking, it's going to be about equal on both sides. But I think the more important thing to point out here is that when they give us the line of analysis about government incentives not showing people the good, I would say that's probably not true, right? The average government, especially ones that, you know, want to retain political power by convincing voter bases that they're doing good things, have every incentive only showcase good things, showcasing the potential of their projects. Like how when China shows off their 5-year plan of propaganda in like rural Chinese cities every single year, just to entice people in thinking, oh, you know what? Maybe this is the year that the economic progress actually trickles down to our city this year, but it never actually does, right? Then they say, you know what? It's included. We need people to feel included versus feeling as though they're resisting the government that they love. I think there's two responses here, right? Firstly, note that the premise to feeling like the change is happening with you is twofold. Firstly, you have to know that the bad thing is happening. I would contend that a lot of people are ignorant of the actuality of how bad the situations of a lot of marginalized populations actually are. But secondly, note the logic here, right? If people think like projects are already going on without them actually participating in and things are already improving or things have positive and optimistic outlooks without them, it probably means that they haven't contributed anything, that the issues are being fixed in and of themselves, right? And so this allows people to get the bystander effect where it's not them feeling included, it's more likely that they don't address these issues whatsoever. But secondly, note that like in a lot of these circumstances, I'll bite the bullet, right? Even if it means that a lot of people do support the government, I would support a narrative or a countervailing narrative that shows that the government should look bad sometimes, because a lot of the times the structural issues do come from the government in the first place. So then, firstly, why is it that we're more likely going to attain critical mass? I think there's three reasons here, right? Firstly, on a broader coalition, I would say that people tend to disagree on what kind of world they want, different value systems, belief in the role of government, but broadly identify with shared experiences. This is important because the experience of receiving low wages, of discrimination, are pretty universally shared. Even if you haven't experienced it, you probably know and care about someone who has, and even if you don't experience the exact same type of discrimination, you likely feel one that is similar or one that you can empathize or relate to, right? Thus, highlighting these issues means that you can simply bring a bigger, broader base of people in. Moreover, people who aren't aware of your premise are more likely going to join the movement, right? If the primary focus of the movement is raising awareness of issues that exist right now, people can start to engage with the premises of social movements. Conversely, if the focus is on the constructive changes that you want to make, your base is limited to people who are already aware of and agree with your premise. Others are more likely to see this activism as unfounded and continue to side with the organizations with practical ignorance. And note that there's a few key problems here, right? Firstly, note that these movements largely want moderate and non-believer support, which is probably less effective if they don't already believe in the premise that people have really bad lives, right? You need to actually educate them about how bad shit actually looks like. But secondly, note that this message is uniquely ineffective for marginalized people who oftentimes have already gone through years, if not decades, of false hope, unfulfilled promises from the state, from politicians, lies from society about equality, etc. Right? Like blind optimism is something that is always dangled in front of people who don't have enough in front of them, right? And this is something that is probably just going to be ignored, just like all of the other attempts are right now in the status quo. We need to bring them an actually successful movement, or a potentially successful movement that comes from further educating people about their issues. Secondly, there's less inter and intra-group fracturing, right? Just note here that focusing on specific visions of change is far more divisive, right? Individuals both within and outside of social movements have varied theories on political change. Organizations are structurally unlikely to optimize a solution that is tenable for a large base of supporters, right? Social movements of the 21st century are large, intensely hierarchical. They generally rely on a highly engaged core base of support and periphery that responds to their messaging. This model is necessary in order to properly organize activism, but it also means that the core of the movement is likely to exhibit groupthink, to project the viewpoint of the most committed members onto everyone. The periphery, who supports the general premise of the movement but may not be sold on these policies, is far more likely going to fracture based on divisive conceptions. It also means that fracturing between these movements, if different members of the core have different conceptions of what the future change is, the specific policy that they want to activate for, is more likely going to fracture the movement, like in comparison to, you know, just the most relatable things, which is the similarities in lived experiences, right? This all means that we're more likely going to achieve policy because it gives politicians the flexibility to pursue changes that are politically tenable and actually palatable to the average people. It means that activists can still play their part in terms of keeping political groups in check, keeping politicians in check, and making sure change happens for the demographics that you care most about, but it doesn't restrict the ability for politicians to create change. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition. Invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Sorry, am I audible? I'm just grabbing a timer.
Yeah, now you are.
Okay, cool. Sorry, my mic wasn't working earlier. So
No worries.
1 second. I'll take POIs in the chat, or if you just wave at the screen, that's fine too. Chair, I think there's a reason that Martin Luther King's movement was called I Have a Dream and not Here's the Reality. Because the reality of the world that we live in right now is that people are only going to make a difference and want to contribute to activism at the point at which they recognize that there is a benefit that is going to benefit them, but also that that benefit is actually accessible to them and not just something that like is possibly going to solve a problem that they already know exists in the status quo. I'm going to start with a few clarifications really quickly. I want to note that there was quite a bit of confusion coming from opening opposition. Note that there is an important difference between activist messaging and news reporting. And the difference is the news is probably still going to report on individual instances of sensationalized events. For example, George Floyd's case is still going to be reported on both sides of the house. So I think the importance of this debate is where you get the most messaging for activism or for specific social movements outside of those sensationalized instances that are going to happen on both sides of the house. And I think this is really, really important because note how a majority of opening opposition's case is contingent on the perception that this is just about news. The crucial difference about what activist messaging is it's not just reporting on the goal isn't just making people informed, it's making people want to give a crap, and it's making people want to act on that fact and do something that's actually tangibly beneficial. A few responses to opening opposition then that I think are really, really important. Firstly, on the idea that people right now live in echo chambers of ignorance. I think what OO needs to recognize is that this is actually a concession to the analysis that Josh already gave you, because they concede that people don't click on things that are averse to their or things that they already believe. So they won't click on things that they already disagree with. So I don't see then how on opposition side, people are all of a sudden going to click on things on social media or activist messaging that's against things that they already believe in. If you are a conservative person or you don't believe in climate change, how then on their side of the house are you going to click on activist messaging that's talking about why climate change is bad or why the treatment of African American people in the US is bad? The answer is you're not. And I think especially if that's the one thing that they kind of rest their case on is where you get most critical mass, which I think we actually can co-opt in this debate. I don't think they actually get that benefit on their side. Next, on the idea of what happens when you promise hope and don't deliver it. Here's the problem. I think if we can prove to you that you get at least better activism, that at least partially results in better policies or better treatment or better engagement in social movements, you move one step closer to hope. And note that hope isn't a promise. It's just a recognition that there is something you can work towards and that you should work towards. So I don't think every person in society is going to be a crybaby all of a sudden and cry the minute they don't get whatever this thing that they're hopeful for in 2 years. They're going to recognize that perhaps there's more work that can be done. And they're going to recognize that hope is valuable in getting to that point. But crucially, note that you lose hope faster on their side of the house, because what happens when you're desensitized by media by activism that keeps on telling you have to care about BLM because they give you data on African American people being disproportionately oppressed in society. What happens is you get desensitized, you feel like there is no hope. So I don't understand what OO's benefit is, because they seem to have a problem with losing hope, but that happens faster on their side of the house, so they can't actually claim that benefit. Lastly, on the ability to critique the government. Note that we still have people critiquing the government. We just Trojan horse them into doing this. Because if that doesn't happen on either side of the house, we both agree people won't click if it's something they already disagree with, then what you have to do is trick them into doing that. So for example, a person in India that knows pollution is a problem, that sees fog in Delhi, screwing with everyone's lungs, isn't really going to be incentivized to do anything if your activism is just saying we have to stop climate change. What they are going to be incentivized to act on is at the point at which you tell them, imagine a world where your grandfather didn't get asthma because of all the pollution in Delhi. Imagine a world where you walking down the streets doesn't mean you literally have to pass a trash dump every 5 minutes. I think that's where you get the incentive for people to be hopeful, when you give them something to hope for and not just tell them the world is screwed and that they should feel bad about it. I'm going to extend on Josh's case really quickly. Here's what Josh gives you that I think is really important. It's the ability to get critical mass. Here's how we co-opt opposition's benefits. Why is this debate winning in and of itself? We think that any impact in this debate only matters to the extent that you get critical mass and support for the movement in the first place. 3 things. First, we already explained to you in Josh's speech that people aren't going to read for two reasons. One, because they're desensitized, they don't care about it. But second, it's just not accessible. Like if you are a middle-class person that's working to pay for your family's well-being, you're probably not going to sit down and read data and read like news reports on a group of people that are not that you are not affected by. And I think that's like largely unresponded to coming from opening opposition. But on desensitization, panel, it does not matter how many times you shove the inequalities of society down someone's throat until you get them to do something about it. Like you can tell a person 100 times, 1,000 times that these inequalities exist. Maybe they'll feel bad, but we don't care whether they feel bad or not if they don't act on it. And the only time they're going to act on it is when they have something to look forward to. Here's the important thing. Even if they do look at these data or do look at this type of messaging, Josh gave you a pretty comprehensive argument about why they often turn into a nihilistic view and why desensitization is so bad. I think one of the biggest roadblocks in activism right now is largely not a lack of knowledge of the existence of inequalities. Maybe you don't know everything, but a lot of people know these inequalities or problems in society exist. It's a lack of understanding of what you can do to solve them or what you can do to fix them or what you are even working towards. Like you have to know what your money is going towards before you donate to a charity or donate to an activist group. If they're just telling you that things suck right now, you probably aren't incentivized to donate to them at the point at which if things are so bad, what is my money going to do? You have no incentive to donate to them. Here's the unique thing coming from my speech that I think is really important. Activism needs there to be a trade-off. What does this look like? It looks like you as a person willing to make some inconvenient trade-offs with your use of fuel or plastic as part of the climate change movement. It looks like you as a male being willing to give up some of the patriarchal institutional frameworks that you benefit off of because you are hopeful for a future where your sister or your daughter does not have to face inequality. Why is hope uniquely valuable? We think it's human nature to search for happy things. It's the converse of the previous argument where people, when they come back from having a hard day at work, they don't want to look at information or activism about other people suffering. They want to look at happy things. When you give them something to be hopeful for, we think that's when they're more willing to make the trade-offs that we need people to make in order for activism to be successful and to get those policies. But activism is hard. You have to give money, you have to give time, you have to have a reason to feel like all those sacrifices are worth it. And you only do that at the point at which you have something that you are hopeful to achieve in the future. I think this is really, really important because anything in this debate only matters to the extent where you get critical mass, and you only get critical mass where people not only know about the problems, where people are not only worried about it, but they actually want to do something about it. Vote for OG.
I thank the DPM, invite the DLO.
First thing I want to do is answer the trivializing conception we heard from OG that basically the news will cover George Floyd, therefore people don't need to be educated about the scope of these issues. I have two concerns here. Number one is that calling attention to these issues on the base of activists and getting millions of people to see these things through the wildfire of social media is probably what creates the culture under which media covers these issues in the first place. The reason why climate change and inequality discourse gets coverage in mainstream media today is not because that is the mandate of CNN, which is a corporate entity that responds to what its viewers want to see and hear. It's because literally millions of people were exposed to this discourse because activists put pressure on politicians to talk about these things when for decades they did not, even though these issues existed far before George Floyd passed away. But second, and more importantly, the vast majority of people are not debaters. They are not plugged in to liberal Twitter, and they literally do not know about the scope of some of these things. It's about the insularity of communities that are not exposed to things like racism. The fact that you could grow up in a neighborhood and see maybe one Black person in your entire school means that you don't literally understand the experiences of racism that people go through. If you can't conceive of these things and you don't understand the premise, then when you hear someone calling for affirmative action, you write that off as being these people want to take my right to education away, as opposed to recognizing and engaging with the fact that there is real discrimination on the ground. Calling attention to discrimination is not just about throwing out statistics. It's about elevating people, elevating their voices and their stories, and the humanizing aspect of that all individuals can relate to, even if they didn't come from that specific background. If they say that people are going to be desensitized because they heard 10 statistics, I don't think they're talking about the right group of people. The people who have seen 10 statistics about this are already already plugged into the core of the movement and are likely to donate otherwise. And even if they aren't likely to donate, I think this says a lot more about the specific people OG wanted to talk about than the vast majority of people who know literally nothing about these issues and need to know about the existential threat of climate change and the violence that occurs against Black bodies in the United States. The fact that George Floyd's death is what activated people for racial justice is indicative of this point, and OG essentially ceded that to us. 3 other things in the speech. 1, why is legislative change the most important and why do we win under it? 1, we say that most discrimination is structural. It is enabled by systems that exist like neoliberal capitalism and state-sanctioned discrimination under which individual actions can occur. And 2 is that in democracy specifically, the mode of change that people see as legitimate is legislative change. That is, people view the rule of law as legitimate irrespective of their party or political preference. This means that people tend to cater to the lowest common denominator under the law. That is, if the law says that you should be locked up for smoking weed, then people are probably okay with it and don't see that as unjust in the same way that they would if you actually change the law. So getting legislative change is the most important for getting broad-based buy-in to said changes. Why do we think social movements are more likely to achieve said changes on our side? We think there are 2 reasons why. Number 1 is that politicians are in a better position to make said changes, whereas activists are uniquely in the position to elevate the issues and put them on the docket in the first place. I think Brian mechanized this really well in 2 ways. 1, he told you that the activist core of these movements is probably not going to optimize for the policy that people actually want, because they're the most plugged into the movement, but they aren't necessarily plugged into what the periphery wants and what the median voter wants, which are actually the people that decide what goes through. The key here is that on their side of the house, then the political leaders have to either bind themselves to an unpopular conception that the movement pushes forward, or more likely distance themselves from the movement even if they agree with the premise. On our side, they can bind themselves to the movement by saying, yes, we agree racial discrimination is a problem, even if the solution that's actually likely to pass a Congress or a parliament is not exactly the one the activists want, it's probably still a win. But the second thing we're going to say here is that you're more likely to disappoint the supporters of the movement on your side of the house, which engages with the analysis about desensitization. It's the analysis that Brian gave you, right? That minorities are told again and again that they're going to get specific public goods and then they're denied them. And when this happens continually, they're less likely to view movements as efficacious and more likely to bow out of them for the same reasons that OG gave you, that people have to spend time, money, and energy to invest in these movements. They have to believe that they can succeed. On our side of the house, if you get political change under the issue you care about, that is seen as a win. On their side of the house, if that political change does not benchmark against what the activists said they were going to deliver, that is seen as a failure. And the more likely it is seen as a failure, the less likely people stay committed to these movements, which is the most important consideration for getting durable change. 2 more things then. 1, why do changes specifically require short-term costs, and why are individuals uniquely loss averse? Firstly, we think people are loss averse. People do not want to lose what they currently have much more than they want to gain something new. And this is because of the idea of a diminishing marginal utility. That is, the first $100 you have is more important than the next $100. And because people have already associated a certain affiliation with the things that they have. They love their home, they love their neighborhood, they love their community. They don't necessarily or don't have the ability to conceive of an alternative world. When you highlight the changes that you want, it's probably going to lead to the calling of attention to the short-term costs that come with said changes. That is, if you push for a carbon tax or you push for more aggressive lockdowns to contain COVID, then it allows your opposition to latch onto the fact that you're paying more in taxes or the fact that the economy is going to be hurt as a result of those lockdowns. That is, people latch onto the costs of said change more than they latch onto the benefits of said change, and so the changes do not go through. On the flip side, when you highlight problems right now, you tend to highlight the losses that people are likely to experience if nothing is done. That is, when you highlight the existential threat of climate change, you call attention to the literal natural disasters that are going on, and the fact that the state of California is on fire, or the fact that 220,000 of our brothers and sisters have died from the pandemic. People are more likely to see those losses, be averse to them, and viscerally respond by demanding change. So even on that front, in terms of the way people conceive of issues, we think we are better off. Quickly, I'll take closing. Opening.
People are only willing to turn out if they feel like they can learn and listen and understand that there's hope for something. But conversely, politicians need to internalize this narrative too and feel like there's a chance. They also buy in, or else they're not willing to make the trade-offs that activism legislation requires.
So 2 things. Number 1, in terms of actual constructive changes, we still think that politicians can optimize for what said changes are and can run on those changes. But the way that you get them to prioritize said issues is by attaining a critical mass, which the movement is more likely to do on our side. Number 2, we do think that people are loss averse even in the way that they vote. The reason people predominantly voted for Joe Biden was not because of the fact that he had a specific agenda on healthcare. It was because of the fact that the Trump administration was resulting in hundreds of thousands of people dying and they couldn't accept it. That was what they highlighted. That was what they won. Okay, Last point, how this affects the opposition to your movement. I think it's important to note here that you don't always win, and your opposition is going to be in power at some points in time. We think the opposition is less harmful on our side for two reasons. One, on their side, the opposition latches onto the specific objectionable policies that you have and mount an opposition based on the technical objections to things like taxation, to things like redistribution, which means that not only are you less likely to succeed because of people's loss aversion, you're also more likely to get reactionary forces in power that actively oppose and harm your movement, creating harms to the people you care about. But number two, when you focus on core issues on our side, the opposition is forced to engage. It's hard for them to say that natural disasters aren't happening or that people aren't dying. So even if they disagree with you on terms of policy, they have to come up with an alternative and at least do something about the issue as opposed to nothing. Given that you won't always win, it's important that you make progress at all times, not just the times that you're in power. We're incredibly proud to oppose the motion.
I thank the deputy leader for those remarks. Invite the member of government to open up the back half of the debate.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Realistically, there are two types of people that exist on opposition side of the House. We've heard a lot in this debate about whether or not people will be inspired or whether or not people will be apathetic. We on CG thinks that this is a very black and white debate where there's very little clash unless you engage with the fact that both people can exist on opside the House. We say what's more realistic is on opside the House, you have group A, the people who are desensitized, and this could be people who are disenfranchised in the system, but it's more likely to be people who are moderate, who simply see that there's a lot of like bad things going on in the world and they don't know how to engage with it. So they just decide to feel apathetic and don't click onto things. And that's the characterization that we got from opening government. But we also say there's type 2, and we emphasize that type 2 is a lot more pernicious and type 2 is a lot more likely to happen, or at least more likely to happen in the way that opening opposition frames it. And this type of person is a type of person who grows disenchanted with the system and then grows violent. Because there is no particular action except for things are bad right now. The system is bad right now. We don't think this looks like what opposition tells you, where politicians are like, oh, I should do something to help out. We think what this looks like is people who are disenfranchised, people who are disenchanted with the system, turning to actions like violence. Now, violence can be good in some circumstances because it pushes people to react, as we heard with like things like climate change, right? But what we think what happens with this movement is you get less people who want to buy into this violence, want to buy into protests, because people on a whole don't like violence. And secondly, violence, we think, is very unproductive because of the fact that there is no standard for when it's good enough, for what the violence is fighting for. That's why you have things like protests that people simply say, well, like, what can we do about it? People are angry, so what? Right? And the fact that you have people who can then backlash against that and say like, oh, those are violent people, we don't want to be like them, and then they grow apathetic. Okay, so that's roughly some stances in terms of what we think actually exists in terms of like people and how they act on opside the House. So what I'll be doing for you is first going into more specific refutation and then going into a constructive point about how accountability and visions actually changes the way in which people engage in activism, and specifically the role of activists and their role in mobilization. So firstly, getting into some refutation. So we hear this idea out of opposition about a critical masses who is more likely to scrutinize the government. So firstly, as we agree with our opening government, the news exists. What we've heard is that the news is less likely to push forward these individualistic stories and share the true extent of horrors. Firstly, we say, what is the incentive of the news? The incentive of the news is to be sensationalist. And insofar as they have an incentive to be sensationalist, if anything, they're more likely to blow up that message of things are dire here right now, because that is what gets you the clicks, right? We think activists are uniquely different than news outlets because they don't have this incentive. They have an incentive to mobilize. They have an incentive to push for something more specific. Well, the news has an incentive to inform. We think the news does not necessarily change on either side of the House. And while the activists may push for like more critical news on their side of the House, we think this will oftentimes exist either way because of the incentives of the news to be sensationalist. So we don't think the news changes very much. We think activists' messages change, which is separate from the news, a separate entity, looks more like opinion pieces, looks more like social media, looks more like general cultural movements and messages. rather than like talking about news in particular. But secondly, they talk to you about like politicians and how politicians are more likely to be able to do things because like, they're able to push more palatable policies. So first of all, we think this is bad on the whole in terms of like politicians can throw you a bone and you're going to be like, yeah, that's good. But we think that's not actually what's likely to happen because there is no end goal. People are more likely to be dissatisfied with ever what politicians do. But more importantly, we think that politicians are likely to do nothing because they don't know what these movements actually want. They might promise some things in campaigns, but insofar as what they'll do will never be good enough because these like movements don't have a vision, we don't necessarily think you're likely to get those politicians. More on that in my constructive. Actually, I'll get into my constructive now. So my constructive is the fact that accountability that comes from concrete policy that can uniquely only come from thinking on the future is actually more likely to push particular policy goals. So let me frame this for you. So the goal of activists is to mobilize people. And when you have a goal, people are less likely to be complacent with the status quo because they have some framework of metric to compare against. Rather, on side of the house, you know that things are bad, but you don't really know what you're striving for, so you're just angry, right? This means that whatever the government does, you're likely to be complacent with it because of the fact that like you don't know what you're fighting for. Standards are very important in this regard because it means you're able to push for the government to take very specific actions. Now they say this might fragment the movement because the movement does not necessarily know or agree on what action to take. We say this is okay because this type of discourse generates productive conversations about what the world could look like and what we are fighting for, right? We think that having a polarized movement or having a movement which is discussing is better than a movement where everyone agrees that things are bad, but they're not exactly sure what they want to do with it. Now, what uniquely changes then? So firstly, as we said, you're likely to get more violent mobs on their side of the house who are disenfranchised and disenchanted with the system, but not exactly sure what they want to do. So they simply just continue being violent, and this takes away support from the movement as a whole because people tend to be averse to violence, right? But we say that politicians are less likely to listen because of the fact they don't know what these movements are fighting for. On our side of the house, the alternative is that when candidates see that there are specific discourses arising in these communities, and perhaps some discourses are more favored overall, for example, things like raising welfare, maybe things like UBI in some circles, now candidates who may have not run before because they felt like their policies were too radical are able to actually step forward because they see that there is a specific base for them. This looks like candidates like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Andrew Yang, who are able to see that people have a vision for the future and that they can be the people to supply this vision. Comparatively, on their side of the house, you don't get these more radical candidates coming forward because the movement does not know what they want, so the candidates don't know how to respond to it. It's sort of like supply and demand, I suppose. They know that there's a demand for something, but they can't supply it because they don't know what people are demanding. Secondly, we think that people are more likely to be pushing for these specific things because they're empowered by history. So people will look in the past and see that, hey, we have gotten somewhere by holding governments accountable, by saying, no, we will not compromise on things like gay marriage. Yes, things can get better if we push to it. And we think through this, you're more likely to get the benefits the government talks about, like donations from lobbyists and whatnot, because people know that there's an end in sight because they can look back at history and say like, hey, we did get somewhere. And finally, we think that this push for policy focuses on innovation, which we think is severely lacking on opposition side of the house, when people are less likely to be able to innovate because they're so stuck in the paradigms of today, thinking that things will not get better. So what have I done for you in terms of differentiation? I've told you specifically what like on opposition side of the house is pernicious, which is the idea of violence, which they have to contest with that people will be violent, but specifically how having a standard holds politicians accountable to some sort of standard of policy and how you're more likely to get politicians to step forward when there is this sort of concrete policy. And lastly, on why discourse is generally good within the movement insofar as it creates more innovation, creates more incentive for policy. What we need out of an opposition is to contend with the fact that people might get violent on their side of the house, violent moms that don't necessarily have a particular direction. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
I thank the member of government, invite the member of opposition.
Hey, just a sec. All right, started in 3, 2, 1. Let's put framework for this debate. We think that in order to bring a real change, you need at least 51% of the voters. You need to win over the power structure and the power, like the center of power that want to keep on ruling. And in order to do that, you need more than like 20 very enthusiastic activists. You need actually to more than that 20 activists that are very enthusiastic about a vision that only they believe is actually like can happen, and also only they want them, right? Because we think that the majority of the people actually feel quite nice in the status quo, and they don't they don't want to like go after radical ideas, yeah, right? Like for intuition pap, most of the people would vote Biden, but they wouldn't vote Sanders because Biden suggests some solutions, but not like a whole scheme like Sanders. So let's put 2 points in this speech: one about the sense of urgency, and two about pragmatism, and why we have like more successful efforts that will lead to more engagement with the people. Three quick rebuttals. We get from OG that hope is important. Please note that in this motion, we are activists. Activists, by definition, want to promote some kind of solution, so they might have like hope. Maybe hope, the hope on our side is a bit smaller scale. We don't believe that you'll create a socialist empire, but you just believe that you'll kick out Trump, and you're hoping to get that. So you have some kind of hope. Second of all, we get like the idea that people will get sin sensitized. In order to that happen, it's not enough to them to see like 1 or 2 videos. They need to like be bombarded, like carpet bombarded, in order to like feel like they don't care anymore and they desensitize about death and plugs and things like that. We think that at the point that we are talking about activists, we are not talking about the most central TV station. Activists are very likely to reach for the regular people like once or twice a year. So at that point, I'm really unsure why you get so desensitized. We think that you get more sensitive because like it's the right amount, because you don't have like too much accessibility for the people and to begin with, because you are activists, you are not like a billionaire or something like that. And lastly, you get like the idea that on their side, the solutions for the utopia, everybody agrees what kind of utopia. You don't have any disagreement on that. On our side, nobody knows what is the solution is, so you get like violence somehow. We think that as much as we have like the burden maybe to show that people think about the same solution, they have the burden to show that people think about the same utopia. And the moment that they don't believe that, the moment that they believe that they need some kind of utopia, and they don't think like the Republican Senate or something like that will ever grant them that, that's the way they are more likely to be to result into violence, because they believe that in the current system they cannot do something meaningful, because they don't believe in small change, they believe in revolution. Revolutions tend to be quite violent, as much as I know. Let's talk about how people from the majority, right? Because we want minorities to be like engaged, but we think that they are engaged anyway, they know their problems, and also they don't hold most of the people in the election, they don't hold most of the money, they don't have the power. We need like the people with the numbers and with the money to be engaged. We think that those people usually think that in the status quo the situation is fine, because they don't see the poverty, they don't see the minorities. It's not in their fancy street or fancy shop or something like that. And also they do believe that there are some troubles, but they have this narrative of the end of history, Fukushima, that basically says that the more the time goes, things are solving themselves. What do I mean? We used to have slaves in the US, and now we don't have it. So they just say, oh yes, maybe there are some police brutality and discrimination against African Americans, but this is something that tend to be solved by history. We think that at the point that the Prime Minister himself says that the Education Ministry is controlled by the state, that has an incentive to to produce the idea that that the state is wonderful and everybody is happy. We think that they just say, yes, maybe under status quo, the world is not utopian, but A, the situation is not so bad, and B, we think that over time, things will solve themselves out. So that's fine. Why urgency happening on our side? Because at the moment that we are just showing the scope and the meaningful and the impactfulness of police brutality and things or climate change, that's the moment that they feel, oh, maybe like the situation is not as good as we thought. And maybe like some of the things that we thought that will solve themselves are happening for decades and are part of systemic things rather than things that go with history. Yeah, we think that those things are obviously urgent, because we want to solve police brutality or climate change as soon as possible and not to wait. And also we want to why we want people to feel urgency? A, because we feel there is like objectively urgency. Every year, people are dying, people losing their homes, there are droughts everywhere. We think that at the moment that maybe you don't feel that, at the moment that we are trying to like convince you there is urgency, that's better. And also like when you need to pay something, whether it's in donation or like in election, we think that's more powerful to do that at the moment that you feel that the situation is bad. Before I move on, yes, I will take opening.
So hope and solutions are not linked to a particular administration. So even if the administration fails, you're just galvanized to work harder to put a better one into power. But even if you eventually give up hope, you still lost hope much faster in your world. It did much less work when you focus on the realities that previous administrations never succeeded.
Thank you. So you just assume that people, let's look at 2016. Those people that didn't vote for Clinton, even though they were leftists, do that because she didn't offer them utopia. And those people who just now voted for Biden just knew that you don't look for utopia from Biden. You are looking for somebody that can sway the majority of the people. Let's remember, we tend to speak about minorities a lot. Minorities are the minority in the population. In order to win, you need the majority. Those people who have money, who don't feel the climate change because they not poor people in like the rice in Bangladesh or something like that. We need to convince them the situation is bad, and not to convince them that sometime in the future things will get better, even if they don't know. We don't want them to donate and things like that. Let's talk about being pragmatist. We think that at the moment that they tell you that you need like a socialist utopia, that's the moment that you suppose like fringe like Bernie Sanders, and the majority just rejects you. At the point you lose many votes, you lose many donations, you lose many efforts that could be a go for like more moderate, and like eventually you'll get to utopia by year after year working like gradually. So for these reasons, I call you to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition. Invite the government whip.
Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Perfect. Panel, I think every speaker in this round has fought for noble but ultimately fairly abstract goals in terms of increasing allyship. I think that Simran was the only speaker in this round to give you concrete analysis for how activist messaging in which you focus on a positive version of the future actually leads to concrete change in terms of being able to hold the government accountable, and that even in the best case scenario, you result in a world in which you have like forms of protest that are ultimately harmful and counterproductive for the movement. Very, very proud to propose. So I'm going to be analyzing the debate we just had under two major themes. Firstly, we're going to be talking about the efficacy of the movement and just proving why these social movements are much more effective and create more change on our side. Secondly, we're going to be talking about the attractiveness of the movement in terms of allyship, where I'll more directly engage with closing off. So firstly, in terms of the efficacy of the movement, we tell you that the role of activist messaging is that it primarily exists to mobilize, right? To the extent that it needs to explain to folks like why folks need to ally with a certain movement and why they need to act in a certain way. We think the biggest clash to our extension then comes out of opening up, and I'm going to engage them directly here, where they tell us a couple of things. First, that it's unfair for people to go around having blind optimism, especially in the case of minority groups, and the idea that people can necessarily mobilize and act around a shared lived experience. And secondly, that change is actually going to be effective at the point where you have a less divided movement with disparate goals. So what does Simran then tell you out of extension? She tells you that uniquely on our side, we create the ability for activists to hold governments accountable because we uniquely tell you that painting a positive picture of a potential future exists in tandem with a sense of hope. On op, you get the sense that the system is so broken, so it doesn't matter what you do, so you might as well only act in the short term. Simran then gives you 4 unique mechanisms for how this is necessarily harmful. Firstly, she tells you it leads to violent protest because you think it's the last resort. Quick note that we don't think it's our place or anyone's place in this round to criticize violent protest in in principle, but given that this round is about the efficacy of social movements, and given that everyone has talked about the necessity to create a critical mass around this movement, we think this protest is ultimately going to be less effective. One, because it creates a lack of allies at the point at which, even though you have activist messaging, the overwhelming media coverage simply only frames your movement as violent. You get less attention to goals than anything on OP and specifically on CG wants. But secondly, you have a very short-termist focus, which ultimately can't push towards long-term change. Second bad thing, you create less engagement with the system at the point at which you feel like the system sucks and doesn't matter what you do, causing you to vote less and to actually, if you do vote, critically think about your candidate less because you feel like it doesn't matter. It causes you to, if you're actively part of that movement, to not want to lobby in favor of that movement, to not want to go to protests because you feel that no matter what you do, the system is completely broken. It literally doesn't matter what you do. Third, it leads to less individual activism, because if you've been sexually assaulted, why would you come forward with the sexual assault case if all you do is like scroll through your phone and see like instances of people being turned down in court or not being able to get the justice that they deserve? And finally, and more importantly, we tell you out of an extension that you create less of an ability to actually hold your government accountable at the point at which you're desensitized from like other news and you won't know how the government actively continues to oppress people. The difference is on OP, you have a general sense of the idea that the government is very like awful towards trans people, for example. But on our side, through having a clear like goal for how you want the future to look like and through having clear steps for how you want to get there, you're able to understand exactly how the Trump administration is impacting trans people today, and you're able to like come up with mechanisms to bypass that goal in terms of the candidates you want to vote for and in terms of the goals you want to like fight for. How is this necessarily different from opening government? We think that opening government then broadly tells us about desensitization, about being generally overwhelmed, about how you don't create a critical mass for the movement, but we uniquely mechanize what that desensitization actually looks like and what it actually encourages people to do on the ground right now. We think that's uniquely important then for weighing out our extension. So our side is necessarily good because now you have an incentive to play ball with the system, because you understand that even if the system generally sucks, no thank you, there still exists an incentive for like the system to actually change in your favor. That's necessarily good because you're able to vote for candidates that have policies that cater to you. Candidates now are given an incentive to actually create policies that exist in favor of social movements and that ultimately better the lives of minorities in the long term. Why is this argument then important? Firstly, we're the team that proves the highest likelihood for change, right? At the point at which you're naturally able to sway candidates in order to cater policies towards you, you play ball with the system, which is much more effective than any short-termist mechanisms that naturally result on opposition. Secondly, you have more sustainable activism and you have the greatest long-term access to change, again, because of your incentive to actually exist with the system. Before I continue to my second theme, I'll take a POI from CO.
When there is a clear problem you want to fix now, then there is a clear and pragmatic way to move forward. There is something very clear that can be done to improve the situation.
Okay, I think that like taking that at its best, I think that only occurs on our side, because on your side, you create activist messaging that entirely focuses on how everything is awful right now. You have no incentive to go forward. You have no steps to go forward. I don't understand how that happens. Okay, secondly, in terms of the attractiveness of the movement and on allyship, we hear out of closing op extension two things. First, about how you create more allyship because you have more individuals, and particularly privileged individuals, that are attracted to your movement. Secondly, how you create a sense of urgency, how you have more successful political efforts, and how like that's better. So aside from the fact that we think this extension is kind of like rooted in the OO material, we think firstly that this extension is kind of a wash because the rich themselves are never really going to care about minority groups to the extent that they claim because of the naturally self-interested nature of them, right? They give us no threshold for like why it's likely that this is the tipping point between the rich not caring and the rich caring, given that like so many other mechanisms have existed in the past. But even if you buy that, we think there exists a lot of desensitization in the op world because we think it's a very short-termist activist strategy. We don't think that quantity of information necessarily means that you're automatically going to become more receptive, right? We think on op you create a world in which you now turn away at even like mere pictures of protests or even mentions of protests because you physically feel like you cannot take it anymore. This is bad because one, you create less accountability for governments at the point at which you literally choose to opt out of becoming aware of these things, and you have less general awareness, meaning you're not aware of how to help like your friends and your family that are more impacted by these issues than you are, especially if you are a member of a privileged group. Know that this is going to affect the most privileged folks the most, which is the group that CO wants to like get on the side of activist movements the most, because they have the greatest ability to be ignorant, given that they're not affected by these issues on a day-to-day life, they literally have an ability to opt out of caring about these things. So uniquely on our side, we are the only team that actually mechanizes why it is so bad for activist messaging to entirely focus on how bad the present is right now in terms of holding governments accountable and in terms of actually pursuing long-term policy goals. We think we prove the highest likelihood for change on our side of the house. Very, very proud to propose.
I thank the government whip and invite the op whip to close out the round.
Am I audible?
Mhm.
Okay. So starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay, there are two main clashes in this debate. The first of all is where the message actually goes, like how many people are exposed to the message and who accepts the message and in what manner. And the second clash is what actual change happens. Like the moment people accept the message and the moment the activists have some sort of support and social following, what pragmatic changes do happen in the world. And I'll explain why we from CO win debates from both of those. But before that, several points of rebuttal. And first of all, an answer to closing opposition, which sorry, to closing government, which I think have mischaracterized our explanation of how activism works. When we talk about focusing on the problems today, it doesn't mean that we're not offering solutions. When we say that here there is a problem, then that always comes hand in hand with how to fix a solution. For example, when talking about police brutality and talking about the sad case of, for example, Breonna Taylor, then that comes with a call for justice for Breonna Taylor and for accountability in police and for firing those police officers that were involved and all that. If we're talking about the Me Too movement, where we're talking about how much sexual assault and sexual harassment there is, then that comes along with the call to justice. It comes along with the call for prosecuting these offenders and for improving standards in the workplaces. What doesn't call with pragmatic calls to actions is if we talk about let's look at a world without police brutality, or let's look at a world without discrimination or sexual assault. That is far, far more in the distant future. That is far less immediate. That means that those solutions are far less pragmatic and immediate, which basically attacks their entire case about clear and possible solutions. And that was like basically the final case that my member of opposition gave you. Okay, so now to other rebuttals. So first of all, to opening government, about being exposed to activism. So which they say that if these activist messages won't be like feel good, if they won't be upbeat, then they won't reach any people on the other side of the aisle because these news organizations won't share them. Thing is, people are exposed to activism even if they don't directly support it. Like if there are protests, if there are demonstrations, then most news organizations will cover those protests and organizations, even if those protests and demonstrations like aren't on the side of that news organizations. And if the protest is in a highly populated area where most protests are, then the people living there will be exposed to the protest. The thing is, activists do their best to make people exposed to the protests, even if they don't directly support the activism. Like that's their jobs. And also about the case of it from closing about violence, 99.9% of any movement don't turn to violence. Like violence is an extremely extreme case. Most people don't go to violence. So therefore, we don't see why that small minority of people who do turn to violence matter. And that wasn't really explained. So we'll move on. Okay, to the clashes. First of all, about who accepts the message. So from governments, well, both governments talk about desensitizations. They say that there are people who want to get to the message too, and they just won't listen to it. They'll turn it off. They'll insulate themselves because it's easier to not care than to say how much depression there is. Well, first of all, both oppositions, like both opening and us, already explained that these people are the people that are most critical to the goal are removed from are removed from the plate. That means that if there's, for example, talk of police brutality, then saying to them, imagine a future without police brutality doesn't do anything to them if they are not exposed to police brutality. But yes, and also about what closing government said about rich people, like rich people are naturally self-interested. Well, that's just like, that's kind of racist. Rich people aren't more naturally interested than anybody else. If I'm a rich person and I have empathy and I hear about somebody having problems, then I am more inclined to donate money to fix the problem. I'll take a POI later. So where we differ from OG is that OG explained how we get the message to people that don't necessarily support it in the first place. But member of opposition says more than that. He says how we get the message to the majority of the population. It's not not enough to get the message to simply more people. It explains specifically how we get it to the middle upper class, the people who aren't exposed to the problem in the status quo, where only by expressing to them how much the problem is bad can they be made to move. Yes, and also we are the only group who talk about the urgency of the situation, where each moment that passes where change doesn't happen is a moment where people die. And therefore, urgency only happens when you light a fire under people's feet. They are not called to urgency when you see a distant future where everyone can be happy. You are not called to urgency when there is a vision where you can work towards. You are called to urgency when you see there is a problem now. People are dying now. People are being like hurt and killed or sick or whatever now. And therefore, when you see people are dying of malaria in Africa now, that makes you get up on your feet and donate to malaria. Whereas you see a distant future, then it's just maybe it will happen. That's like that only, we get that from feel-good inspiration, and feel-good inspiration is not enough because just escapism doesn't get people to engage with reality. Yes, okay, so now to where we get actual pragmatic change. But before that, I'd like to take opening if you have a POI. No? Then closing.
Protest demanding urgency without knowledge, buy-in, or hope only triggers resentment and desensitization. It doesn't matter how many people know how bad it is if that doesn't translate into action.
It does translate into action. It's the exact example I gave you. If there are protests against police brutality, then they call for like regulation against the police. They call for justice for Breonna Taylor. If there are the protests of the Me Too movement, then they call for firing the people who are have offensive. If we are calling against climate change, then we are calling for prosecution and regulation against the oil corporations that dump oil into the harbor or that burn like coal without any repercussions. These always do come with the change. With the actual change, and that is the second class where actual change comes. Because Eyal explains to you how our side is the pragmatic side, and our change, the actions are specific, step by step, year after year, because we can far easier get legislation. Opening opposition said like that politicians have the power and activists like bring up these issues to the politicians, but it's not enough to bring up these issues to the politicians. We need to tell the politicians what issues we want to fix, and only on our side do we get politicians saying like regulate against against police brutality, or make these laws like for equal representation in the workplace. Or we come with strict demands, and these strict demands translate into better actions, which is far, far more effective than just generally telling politicians we need this. Also, it's not enough to it's not enough for politicians to know that some activists care about the problem. They need donations, signatures, supporters, like a massive show of force. And Eyal specifically explains to you how we get not just more people to support, but the necessary majority of the population to support, the people who weren't necessarily supportive, the middle upper class who also support. And it's only when the politicians see not that are supporters, but there are many supporters, can actual action come to pass. So because we get the message to more people, and because we do get actual more pragmatic change, glad to oppose. Thank you.
I thank everyone for a great round. I'm going to go deliberate by myself. Just stay here, and then I'll be back.